The muskrat, like people who trap it, usually frequents regions with an abundance of aquatic vegetation. It settles wherever it finds a sufficient supply of plants to use as food and building materials for its den. I have often seen muskrat in swamps and marshy areas near lakes or slow-moving streams. Other muskrat dig burrows in banks or take over abandoned beaver houses. The muskrat's favorite foods include the stems and roots of cattails and bulrushes. It also likes pondweed and the roots of water lilies. In short, its diet consists primarily of water plants. When their usual foods are difficult or impossible to find, muskrat may become partially carnivorous. They will eat mussels, frogs, crayfish, and even the carcasses of other muskrat. This diet does not really agree with them, however, and is usually considered an indication of hard times. The muskrat gets its name from the fact that it has two musk glands. It uses scent from these glands to mark out its territory and attract attention during the mating season. The musk glands are located in the anal region of the male. This rotund mammal is a member of the rodent family. The muskrat is the most common and widely distributed fur bearer in North America. Although it is not a suspicious creature, it is a good idea to study the territory and learn some of the animal's habits before trapping. I have often seen muskrat in fall and spring sitting on mounds of earth, rocks, or objects floating in the water. They may use these sites for eating, washing, or marking out their territory. The old tree stump found by these two trappers, for example, looks like a perfect site for a trap. Oh yes, did you notice the droppings? There must have been a muskrat in the area recently. Now we know this is a good site. What kind of trap are we going to use? Did you guess right? They've opted for a drowning set. The trapper cuts a notch in the log to hold the trap, a number 1.5 Victor. It's a good idea to make a notch so the trap will sit level with the surface of the log and won't move. The trap may be placed a little above or below the water level. It doesn't really matter. However, the trap spring must be positioned well away from the muskrat's paws. This way, the animal won't shift the trap before reaching the trigger. The pan should be level with the jaws, and the sides of the jaws should be parallel to the sides of the log. Otherwise, the trap, when sprung, may throw the muskrat's leg up in the air and you'll lose a good catch. Unfortunately, the old saying, "you win some, you lose some," doesn't really apply to trapping. Believe me, there's no such thing as a lucky trapper, just a trapper who does his job well and leaves nothing to chance. Once the muskrat is caught, the trap should drag the animal to the side of the log on which the water is deepest. If the trap chain doesn't reach to a spot that is deep enough, lengthen it with some wire, then fasten it to a stake driven into the bottom of the stream. Our trappers have made sure there's enough water here. It has to be at least 60 centimeters deep to prevent the animal from returning to the surface. This method is called the drowning set, but this is somewhat of a misnomer, since the animal doesn't really drown. Water doesn't usually enter the lungs of an aquatic animal. When the muskrat is kept underwater by the weight of the trap, it goes into a coma and dies from oxygen deficiency and the buildup of carbon dioxide in its lungs. Once the trap is securely attached, remove any obstacles around it, and all you have to do now is drive the pole in firmly. The drowning system is an effective method if the water level around the trap remains fairly constant, but I don't advise using it where the water level varies because of rain or melting snow. Wait for my next method. These are floats. They are aptly named. The traps are attached to pieces of dry wood or natural rafts. Like a boat, a float isn't bothered by variations in the water level, as long as it's not subjected to low tide. This time, the trapper planed the log instead of cutting a notch into it. This makes a smooth base on which a 120 conibear trap is most likely to stay put. The trapper is using a 3-inch nail system to keep the traps in place on the float. You may have heard of it. First, place 2 nails in a straight line and then position a third nail 3 or 4 centimeters from the center of the line formed by the first 2. The nails will then form a triangle. Careful! Always place the jaws of the trap outside the nails, or you won't have much of a harvest. The nails must hold the trap securely. Make sure, however, that the trigger remains quite sensitive so the trap isn't too hard to spring. And don't test the trigger with your fingers. The trigger wires should cover as much area as possible between the jaws. If you think the muskrat might be able to pass through the trap without touching the trigger, place the wires further apart. And finally, don't forget to remove the safety hooks and attach the trap chain, or all your hard work will be wasted. I've lost traps in the past because ice or floating debris pulled up my work. You won't have this problem if you make sure not to do things by halves. Anchor your float securely with a pole placed in the hollow part of the log. To make my traps even more effective, in the spring, I sometimes use a lure made from the muskrat's musk glands and a little glycerin. Why not add a bit of mud and grass as well? This gives the impression that creatures other than the brawny trapper have recently climbed up on the log to feed. Now the rats won't be able to resist. I like using floats, and there are all sorts of variations. Like this trapper, I think it's a good idea to attach a crosswise piece of wood under the end of the log. And this little piece of wood acts as a stabilizer, keeping the float pointed in the same direction as the current. I placed the floats a fair distance from the water's edge to prevent the trapped muskrat from clutching at or falling into branches on the bank. And above all, be sure that your trap chain is fastened securely. Sometimes I use the same 120 conibear traps on tree stumps or sloping trunks. I use the 3-nail system to fasten them to the wood, being very careful to place the trap outside the nails. If you think there may be significant variations in the water level, don't use this method. Your traps will be wasted. Three quick knocks, and here's our trapper. Yes, you can also attach a Victor trap to a float with a 3-centimeter finishing nail. It's best to use a number 1 or 1.5 Victor trap. These are heavy enough to drag the muskrat to the bottom of the stream. The notches at either end of the log should be made deep enough to hold an open trap. Use a nail to keep the trap steady, but make sure it won't prevent the trap from falling into the water when the animal springs it. To trap the animal properly, the jaws must be facing the same direction as the log. In other words, they must be parallel to the log, and the pan must be level to the jaws. I don't use bait with these traps. Carrots and turnips attract migratory birds, but even without bait, birds have a tendency to land on floats. To avoid catching one accidentally, just bend a stiff piece of wire into a circle and fasten it above the trap. If a bird decides to land on the log anyway, it won't touch the trap. It's best to attach this wire to the sides so the muskrat can still climb up either end. Attach the chains, keep the traps away from each other to avoid catching one muskrat in 2 traps, and finally, leave the site quietly. Most traps for muskrats are set in the water. And here's another one, the submarine trap. Submarine traps are usually made of galvanized screening with a 2 to 3 centimeter square mesh. This model has only one opening. Place the trap in the water at an angle. The screen over the entrance must appear slightly above the water, while the lower part rests on the bed of the stream or river. This method cannot be used in all regions. Since the laws are constantly changing, it's important to check with your local authorities before using this technique. That way you'll avoid a lot of trouble. Fasten the trap to a stick. It should be fairly thin, so the muskrat won't be able to use it as a support and climb up on the trap instead of going inside. Position the trap by placing the ends of the stick on either bank of the stream. That's it. This is one of the easiest trapping techniques. The only problem is that the traps are rather large to carry around. Look, a big mosquito. Arrange some branches on either side of the trap as well. These obstacles force the muskrat to dive down into the trap. Bait is rarely used with submarine traps, although some trappers weave aspen shoots through the screen at the bottom of the trap when installing them under ice. Instead of luring muskrat into the trap, this technique is designed to catch them as they go by. Since one trap can catch a number of muskrat in a single night, I try not to leave them too long in one place to guard against over-harvesting the population. Think about it. The trapper who takes care of the resource will have it to enjoy that much longer. These traps can be set in marsh runways, shallow creeks, or culverts, or along well-defined muskrat water routes. Here is another model from our trapper's collection of submarine traps, the two-door version. This is a kind of tunnel with black openings, which the muskrat takes for a channel. It is thus led to dive down into the trap. The best location for this set is in a channel barely wider than the trap. If you can't find a narrow enough spot, put the trap in the middle of a stream and use brushwood to block off the sides. Position this trap in the same way as the last one, but use two sticks this time. Fasten them at either end of the trap. Rest the sticks on the banks, and you're done. Notice that this trap is placed in a horizontal position. At the end of each funnel, there's a swinging door that opens when the muskrat pushes on it to get in, and then closes behind the animal. The door doesn't open from the inside. Make sure the trap is completely submerged to ensure a quick death for the muskrat. The top of the trap should be at least 3 centimeters below the surface when the water level reaches its lowest point. It's a good idea to make sure the trap is held securely by attaching it to a branch near the water's edge. This way, you know the trap will stay in place even if there's flooding. The branches arranged around the cage keep it in place in deep water, forcing the muskrat to dive into the cage. Before leaving the site, I always take one last look at the trap and make sure it's completely underwater. This is it. That in-between time is here, the time when you know that winter is on its way. This is the time of year when I hate going into the water to set traps. I have to put away my canoe because the ice is now just a little too thick, but it's still not thick enough to hold my weight. Before winter comes, I'll make one more trip to the place where the muskrat live, in a sea of cattails and bulrushes. This mammal builds 2 types of houses. One is a dwelling house, and the other serves as a feeding area. These are similar in shape to a beaver lodge. They are not made of branches, however, but of cattails, bulrushes, dry or green, and water plants. The muskrat or water rat is very prolific. Its mating season begins quite late in the spring and continues until July or August. The female may produce 18 or 20 young a year in 2 or 3 litters. This high birth rate compensates for the natural death rate. It is estimated that approximately 87% of muskrat die of natural causes in their first year. Scarcely 2% reach the age of 3. Trapping is the best means of controlling muskrat numbers, and it protects them from the epidemics that often occur when the population becomes too large. Fall trapping keeps populations down to levels which are more likely to survive the winter. Spring trapping should stop as soon as you notice that shedding has begun and cuts appear on the hide. I assist in the management of muskrat on my land by monitoring the condition of the local population. In the fall, I check the ratio of young muskrat to adult females in my catches. If there are many young for each female, trapping procedures are judged to be good and the population healthy. If there are few young per female, I reduce my quota to give the muskrat a chance to multiply. Do you see this sight? There are too many fresh signs of muskrat here. Look, this trapper is using modern technology to mark the spots where he will set his traps so that he can locate them in this jungle of cattails when harvest time comes. It's not easy to find your way in this swamp. It's a wonder the muskrat don't lose their young. To find the underwater trails used by the muskrat to get to their houses or feeding areas, I test the ground around the house with my feet. You can feel the depressions made by the paths, which are somewhat like rabbit runways. Only these are underwater and a little harder to spot. Look, our trapper seems to have found one. He's going to use a 120 Conibear trap. Don't pay any attention to the color of this trap. Red is much better for catching the moviegoer's eye than for catching muskrats. Even if you're whimsically inclined, save your artistic inspirations for elsewhere. Dull brown is still the best color for a trap. The trapper is setting his trap. He has thought of everything. The trigger wires are placed well apart, and the safety hooks have been removed. The trigger is at the bottom of the trap, pointing upwards. Good. Now all he has to do is install it. To keep the trap in position, place 2 sticks through the springs and then drive them into the pond bottom. The trap must sit a few centimeters off the bottom so that nothing will interfere with its operation. As you can see, a good pair of gloves and boots help to get the job done. Setting the trap isn't very difficult, but getting to the site may pose problems. Now that we are here, we may as well set a second trap. Muskrat will take up residence just about anywhere as long as the habitat suits their requirements. Even the sound of a highway outside the door doesn't keep them awake. In fact, muskrat live quite happily close to man and his activities. The trapper is going to set his second trap at the house entrance. To find the entrance, walk around the house and test the ground with your foot to find a path leading up to it. When you found it, you might put a small stick in the opening, just to make sure. It should go right into the house. Position the trap as in the channel with 2 sticks inserted through the springs of a 120 Conibear trap. Here's what you'd see if you were a muskrat. And here's a quick look at a similar sight in the spring, when the snow has disappeared and the trapping season is drawing to a close. The same technique can also be used at the entrance of a burrow, either in the fall or in the spring. Muskrat often dig burrows in riverbanks. The burrow entrances used most often are those found below the waterline. Notice the freshly cut cattail shoots floating at the mouth of this burrow. This is the unmistakable sign of the presence of muskrat. Elementary, you say? All you have to do is keep your eyes open. The pyramids built by the muskrat look much less impressive under the snow. And this is what a muskrat house looks like in the winter. In most areas, muskrat are very difficult to trap in the dead of winter. This is a good opportunity for you to rest up. But soon, as the days get longer and the sun's rays warmer, the sleepy muskrat trapper comes back to life. He senses spring in the air. And at this time of year, the ice is still strong enough to support a snowmobile's weight easily. The muskrats have been trapped under a thick layer of ice, very restricted in their movements for some time now. They're getting quite restless. At this time of year, their fur is at its prime. During the winter, life for the muskrat revolves around his house, which can be made out here, the burrow, and feeding platforms commonly called push-ups, which they build under the ice. Several muskrat live down there. Since the house is surrounded by a thick layer of ice, it is very difficult to find the entrances. The simplest way to set a trap at this time of year is to open up the house by cutting the top off until you find the inner chamber. Before installing the trap, carefully clean out the room. Remove any debris that could interfere with the trap's operations. Either a 120 Conibear or a leg hold trap can be used. Since this chamber is large enough, our trapper has decided to use a Conibear. A little bait, such as a piece of carrot, can be placed right on the trigger. There's one important advantage to this system. If you've forgotten your lunch, you can always take a bite of the carrot yourself. Set the trap right on the floor of the muskrat's chamber. Place it so that it faces the entrance as squarely as possible. To hold the trap in place, insert 2 stakes through the springs, as for the 2 sets we just saw. One of the 2 poles must be long enough to extend about 1 meter above the ice. Attach a bit of fluorescent tape to this pole. This way, you can find your traps easily, and won't have to wander about the lake looking for them. Cover the house with clumps of earth, ice, and snow so that it won't freeze inside the room. It's very important not to damage the house needlessly, even when you remove your traps for the last time. It's to the advantage of every self-respecting trapper to protect the resource he or she lives on. Let's peep inside the muskrat house. This is what the setup looks like. The house is on the left and the push-up on the right. The house and burrows are not the only places where muskrat can be found during the winter. In ponds or streams, where the water level varies, they use plant debris to construct feeding platforms between the layers of ice. These push-ups are excellent sites for traps, but they are usually very difficult to find. A dog, trained to sniff them out, is often an indispensable tool. What a good job our four-legged assistant is doing. He really put his heart into his work. Let's follow these trappers for a while. I think they're going to inspect their traps. As with the house, you must take the top off the push-up. This trap was empty and sprung by the trapper on purpose with a stick. Since there was not much room inside the chamber, the trapper had decided to install a leg hold trap. In this case, we recommend using a stop-loss trap. Make sure the trigger and pan are perfectly level once the trap is set. When this kind of trap is used in a push-up, the trap chain must be at least 1 meter long to let the animal dive into the water. Lengthen it with some wire if it's not long enough. To hold the trap in place, pass a stake through the ring on the chain and drive this into the floor of the chamber right beside the trap and as close as possible to the entrance and the water. When a muskrat is caught in this kind of trap, it instinctively dives back into the water. Once in the water, the weight of the trap prevents the animal from returning to the surface. It's therefore important to make sure the chain is long enough for the animal to reach the water where it will die quickly. This time, the trapper and his dog did smell something. See how proud this dog is of his partner? Always be very careful when removing the animal from the trap. Too often, trappers damage their pelts by mishandling them. Rub the fur in the snow to dry it off. This is it. There can be no mistake now. Spring has finally arrived. I don't have to talk myself into trapping at this time of year, let me tell you. I feel reinvigorated. Muskrat are also restless in the spring. You can easily trap them on the trail. Trails are routes the muskrat normally travel along. Throughout the trapping season, muskrat use a regular network of trails or channels to get from one place to another. The trails look like furrows in the grassy bank or the muddy pond bottom. These routes are also found under the ice, but naturally are much harder to locate. They are ideal locations for traps. They also wind through grass, farm ditches, culverts, streams, and gullies that connect two bodies of water. As always, when trapping muskrat, place the trigger in the lower part of the 120 conibear trap, pointing upwards. This way, when the animal's head touches the trigger, the trap will strike its vital parts. As well, with the trigger placed down below, the trap's dog will be less likely to damage the pelts. To keep the trap in place, slide two small sticks diagonally through the springs and between the lower jaws. Drive them firmly into the ground. If you're setting the trap underwater, place a small stick across the top to force the muskrat to dive down. This trap works on a very simple principle. Put one or more traps across a channel, no bait or lure is required. Choose a narrow spot and block off the sides so the animal can't go around the trap. This trap works the same way as a snare set on a rabbit runway. The muskrat's way of life is a good example of adaptation to an aquatic environment. The muskrat has lips that close behind its incisors so that, like a beaver, it can gnaw underwater without swallowing any water. When I notice the first fresh bite marks on the animal's hide in the spring, I stop trapping. These marks indicate that mating is about to begin. Just a piece of advice. A 110 conibear will also do the trick, but only where the water is deep enough to submerge the animal. On the ground, the 110 does not have enough striking force. The 110 conibear is the same size as the 120, but has only one spring. I check these traps faithfully, particularly when they're above water, where my catch is accessible to predators and scavengers, including the two-legged variety. There, now that we've explained all these ways to trap muskrat, all you have to do is sharpen your reflexes. So gather your equipment, get set, and let the trapping begin. But remember that, like ranchers or farmers, we all have a direct interest in making wise use of the land that feeds us. Laws concerning trapping, methods and types of traps may differ between jurisdictions. Consult your local authorities for regulations in your region. All the trapping methods shown in this presentation have been selected and approved by the Fur Institute of Canada. However, all information is subject to change because of continuing research and constant development in new trapping methods.